Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jenny Beal, and this is the Living in Not Knowing section of the Awareness podcast. Today, I'm really delighted to be joined by Bernardo Kastrup. Hi, Bernardo. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jenny.
Many of you will know Bernardo from the Know Thyself conference or from his videos or books. But just for those who don't, I'll start by giving a brief summary of his background. So Bernardo is a philosopher and scientist. He's worked at CERN, the European Centre for Nuclear Research, where he was using artificial intelligence to help interpret the experimental data from the Large Hadron Collider. But nowadays his main focus is in philosophy, and he's developed a model of reality called Analytic Idealism, which is consistent with non-duality and also with science. He has 2 PhDs, one in computer science and the other in philosophy. And he's published a whole host of academic papers and books. And for those who enjoy this podcast, I'd like to recommend one of them to you. It's called Brief Peaks Beyond. I read that, I think, a couple of years after I started studying the direct path. And I found it really clear, very helpful, and an enjoyable read. So that's something for you to look into afterwards. So, Bernardo, you started off as a scientist. How did you come to be interested in philosophy?
Oh, I was born interested in philosophy. I was not formally a philosopher in my youth, but I was always interested in the big questions. The reason I focused on science, I went to university, I was 17 years old to study computer engineering at first. The reason for that prioritization was that you want to have your hands on something. You want to do something concrete. At least I did early in life, and I always wanted to work at CERN, which turned out to be my very first job. I graduated on a Friday, and on Monday I started at CERN.
Wow.
The Monday after that Friday, not a week later. So that's how I started. When I was there at CERN, philosophy was not very present in my mind. We were too busy trying, to unveil the structure of reality at the microscopic level. It was tremendously exciting to me. I was part of the team developing the data acquisition system for one of the experiments in the Large Hadron Collider. Although I was doing that using classical physics algorithms, as you mentioned in your introduction, on the side, I was using AI to do the same thing, to see how they measured up. Ultimately, we used the classical algorithms because AI was just as good, and it was a very new thing back then. So we went conservatively, and we used the classical algorithms. But I paid attention to the result, and what they told me is that, hey, I can build a computer that is as good as a physicist is in discerning the patterns in this data. And that was sort of a wake-up call. Like, we can make AI, we can make artificial intelligence. So what does it take to make it conscious as well? If I can make a computer that is as intelligent as a physicist when it comes to identifying relevant patterns on this data, complex data, what do I need to do extra to have it be conscious as well, to have its calculations be accompanied by experience, just as the calculations in my brain are? And if you think about that carefully enough, for long enough, you realize that whatever you do or don't do only has a bearing on structure and function. And you are not any closer or any further away from making it conscious or not. Whatever you do is all about structure and function and has nothing to do with conscious experience. If you're thinking along that paradigm I was thinking along, and that to me was the realization that there is something wrong in my line of thinking. Because if the question were well constructed, it shouldn't lead me to this impasse, to this brick wall. What is wrong? What assumption have I made that is wrong? So I traced my steps back and I realized that the wrong assumption was to think that consciousness is something that you can create out of material arrangements. That assumption didn't work out. It led to an impasse, to an internal contradiction. And that's when my interest in philosophy became very serious and dominant in my life.
Yes. And many people listening to this will have heard our discussion at the Know Thyself conference last year, and so they'll know a little bit about where you went from there. But for those who haven't, or those who need a quick reminder, can you give a short description of your model of analytic idealism, which you then went on to develop?
So the root of the problem that I faced and that we still face today in the culture at large is this separation between mental stuff and physical stuff, and the attempt to bridge the two sides by saying or by explicitly articulating how mental qualities can arise from physical arrangements. That is impossible. And this impossibility arises from this separation of the physical from the mental. So to avoid the problems, we have to avoid this separation. And the only way to avoid the separation is to understand that mental stuff, conscious stuff, is the only thing that exists, because it's the only thing we ever are directly acquainted with. The colors we see around us, the melodies, the flavors, the smells, this is all mental stuff. These are all experiences. But in doing so, we have to avoid the mistake of thinking that mental stuff exists only here, because then you become a solipsist. You think the world is your own private individual dream, which everything is telling you is not the case. If you were here in my study, you would describe my study in a way very consistent with my own experience of it, which suggests very strongly that we all inhabit a world outside our individual minds. There is a world out there, and I acknowledge that. Analytic idealism acknowledges that. But the world out there is mental too, just like my thoughts are mental. The world is not made of my thoughts, but it is mental like my thoughts. It's easy to understand this. My thoughts are external to you. You do not have direct access to my thoughts. My thoughts are objective from your perspective. You cannot change my thoughts merely by wishing them to be different. My thoughts would still be here even if you were not around. From your perspective, my thoughts are objective and external to you. But from their own perspective, my thoughts are mental. They are subjective. It's mind stuff. So in exactly the same way, there is a world out there, external to us, objective from our perspective. But from its own perspective, the world up there is made of transpersonal experiential states. It's mind stuff. It's thought-like stuff. And when we observe it through this dashboard of perception that evolution has given us or equipped us with, those thoughts or thought-like mental processes out there present themselves to us in the form that we call the physical world. So physicality under analytic idealism is an appearance, a representation of the reality out there. But in and of itself, behind the representation, behind perception, that reality in and of itself is mental. There is something it is like to be nature. Nature is constituted of experiential states, just like we are, but not constituted of our individual experiential states.
Yes, and I think I gathered from our previous conversation that the image we get of the world on our dashboard, there isn't a direct match between that and the world as it actually is in itself. That there's the dashboard hides how it really is, its structure. And
It's not meant to hide. It's meant to disclose, but to disclose it in a manner that is conducive to fitness and survival. I mean, the dashboard of an airplane is not meant to hide the sky outside. It's meant to convey accurate information about the sky outside, but it conveys that information in a sort of a summarized way that is actionable and allows the pilots to fly the airplane safely. And in doing so, the dashboard looks nothing like the sky outside. It shouldn't. Otherwise, it's not actionable. Otherwise, the pilot is overwhelmed with too much information and it becomes impossible to discern what is relevant, what is salient about that information. There is there are too many states, too much entropy, and the pilot will crash the plane. So a dashboard doesn't look like the sky outside. It does convey accurate information about the sky outside, but the dashboard isn't the sky. So you have to take the airplane's dashboard seriously if you want to fly safely. But you don't take it literally as if the dashboard were the sky. You know that it's not. Now,
yeah,
my argument is that our screen of perception, the world of colors and shapes, sounds, flavors, and scents and textures that we see around us, is a dashboard. Why would it be anything else? We have sensors like eyes, eardrums, surface of the tongue, lining of the nose, surface of the skin. These are sensors that allow us to make measurements on the world outside, just like the airplane has sensors that measure airspeed, pressure, position, and so on and so forth. Our sensors present their measurement results to us in the form of perception. Just like in the airplane, the results of the measurements made by the sensors are presented to the pilot in the form of the dashboard. So perception is a dashboard, not a transparent window into the world. Of course, that's what it is. It couldn't be anything else. There are two uh, um, definitive mathematical arguments for why perception is not a transparent window into the world. It cannot show us the world as it actually is. One is based on thermodynamics. If our cognitive states were to mirror the states of the world, there would be no upper bound to our internal entropy, and we would die. The other one is game theory. Evolution would never have favored perception to be a transparent window, to show us the world as it actually is, because evolution is not about truth. Evolution is about survival. It's about fitness. So evolution constructed a dashboard, not a transparent windshield for us to see the world as it actually is. What we call physicality is thus a dashboard representation. We have to take it seriously like the pilot takes the dashboard seriously. If we don't take it seriously, we die. We'll crash the plane. But the mistake we make is we think that physicality is the world as it is. And that mistake is like a pilot saying, my dashboard is the sky outside as it is in itself. No, that's
yeah,
incredibly naive, downright stupid. The world is not physical. The world is that which is represented as the physical when we make measurements on the world, and those measurements are presented to us in the form of perception. Perception is physicality.
so we're shown what we need to know to survive and operate in the world safely.
Yeah.
And in fact, what you're saying is really what the sages throughout the ages have said, that the world is not made of matter, it's made out of consciousness.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, so,
well, I'm not a spiritual student. I'm not enlightened, so you have to take everything I say in this regard with a whole bag of salt, not only a grain of salt. But it- whoever says what you just said, that the world is not made of matter, it's made of consciousness. Whoever says this in a reasonable way, what they mean is not that the world is made of your consciousness.
mm-hmm.
What they mean is that the physical world, because it is a cognitive construct that you make yourself, the physical world is made of your consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
but the physical world is not the world out there. And the world out there, which is represented by you to yourself as the physical world, that world that is really out there, that too is made of consciousness, but then not of your consciousness.
So in your theory, is there just one consciousness, ultimately just one consciousness,
Yes.
or
Yes,
right?
that's from an analytic perspective. If you do not bite this bullet and you say, well, if there are 8 billion people in the world, then there are at least 8 billion fundamentally separate consciousness. Whoever postulates that faces an incredible difficulty, which is, if there are multiple fundamentally separate consciousnesses, one, it's a miracle that they all popped up and coexist because they are fundamentally separate. So why would they all exist right here, right now? And two, how can they possibly interact with one another if they are fundamentally separate? There is no bridge for them to interact. Each one would be its own reality, its own universe. So to avoid these impossible problems, which in philosophy have technical names like the interaction problem or the parsimony challenge, to avoid this, we have to start the other way. Instead of starting with the many and then trying to solve these insoluble problems I just mentioned, we start with one, because then you avoid all of these problems. And then you try to account for how within the one field of subjectivity that underlies our nature, how can it be that the seemingness or the illusion, if you will, of separateness arises? And that's much easier to do. It's much easier to account for the illusion of separateness on psychiatric or psychological terms than it is to account for the interaction of fundamentally separate consciousnesses.
Yes, and I remember you used the concept of multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder as an analogy for how that works, and that explains our sense of being a separate entity. But what about animals? Does the same apply to them and to plants as well? You know, when you look at an animal, it seems it seems to have some kind of identity of its own, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Um, we have excellent reasons to believe that other people have private conscious in their lives as just as we do. And when I say private, what I mean is conscious in their life that is dissociated from its context. Because I don't know what's happening in China right now. I don't know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda. I can't even read your thoughts. So clearly, I am cognitively dissociated from my context. Therefore, we can speak of my having private conscious in our life. Now, we know that we have it based on the external behavior of other animals like dogs, cats, and so on. I believe we have very good reasons to think that they have that too, because their behavior is analogous to ours. And we know that in our case, those behaviors are motivated by inner experience, separate from its environment. So it's reasonable, eminently reasonable to say that the same apply to cats and dogs. How far can we go in this inferential line? Well, we can go down to single-celled organisms. If you observe amoeba under a microscope, they flee from danger. They seem afraid. They go after food. They build little houses out of mud particles they pick up from the bottom of the puddles where they live. And those houses have a conical shape, and then they inhabit those houses. I mean, their behavior is surprisingly analogous to our own. They seem to have fears, desires. They seem to even think in a way when they build their own houses. There is some degree of spontaneous planning actions involved in there. So, okay, that's one line of inference. All living beings seem to manifest behavior consistent with their having dissociated private inner experience. Is there anything else that ties us all together? Well, yes, despite the amazing variety of shapes and functions of life, you know, things can be as different as a parrot from a whale, or an amoeba from a mushroom. Despite that amazing range of differences, if you look with a microscope, all life is very similar. All life metabolizes. In other words, all life undergoes um, protein transcription, protein folding. Most life burns ATP for energy. They undergo mitosis or cell division. So metabolism, which is a very specific phenomenon, distinct from everything else going on in nature, applies to all life. So I think we have, on these two accounts, enough reason to think that life, biology, metabolism, that is what dissociation in the mind of nature looks like when observed from the outside. In other words, when observed from across at least one dissociative boundary. So all life probably has private inner experience.
Yes, yes, and we can infer that from what we observe of life. But what about what we regard as inanimate objects? I mean, rocks, for example. How do we know that a rock doesn't have some form of, or perhaps we don't know that a rock doesn't have some form of inner life, which is beyond anything we can detect, because our dashboard doesn't require us to be able to detect it?
We have to drop the attempt to know for sure, because it's impossible. That's not the
Right.
name of the game. The name of the game is, what do we have good reasons to entertain as a hypothesis? I don't think we have any good reason at all to entertain as a hypothesis that a rock has its own conscious inner life. And not only because it doesn't manifest behavior consistent with it, not only because it does not metabolize, so there is no reason for us to say about a rock what we can say about living beings, but also because there is no rock. We have to avoid the error of thinking that everything we have a name for exists as a proper part of reality. The ontological structure of reality does not have to mirror the structure of language. Why would it? Language is something we created for convenience. Not everything that we have a name for actually exists as a proper subset or a proper part of nature, including rocks. One can say that all inanimate objects are just nominal. They are segments of reality that we carve out of their context out of convenience. We only do that in language. There are no rocks separate from the mountain where the rock rests. Where does the river end and the ocean begin? You might say, well, it's functionality. So the spark plugs are integral to the car, and the car is a thing because the car moves, and without the spark plugs, the car doesn't move. Well, the car doesn't move without the road that the tires have to grip in order to produce movement. And the car doesn't move without gravity to pull the car towards the road so the tires can grip the road. And the engine of the car doesn't burn without air for combustion to take place within the cylinders. And if you go into quantum entanglement, then you realize that there are no inanimate objects. Carving out the inanimate universe into separate objects is purely nominal. It's something we do in language, and it's arbitrary. It's for convenience. So you know that you have to go to the car salesman to get yourself a car. In other words, to get a segment of the universe under circumstances that segment can be useful to you. Beyond that, there is no car, there is no rock, there is no table. Otherwise you end up in a completely stupid situation in which you say, as a panpsychist, you could say, well, my table is conscious and it has 4 legs. And I go and I pull out one of the legs and I say, okay, now is the leg conscious? And the panpsychist would say, well, the leg is conscious. And if I nail the leg back to the table, is the leg still conscious in its own right, or is it now the consciousness of the table? Now you get into this stupid lines of thinking because
mm,
we are projecting the structure of language onto reality. And the structure of reality is not the structure of language. Only living beings are real parts of reality. Because the boundaries of living beings are not determined nominally or by convenience or by language, they are determined empirically. If I stick a needle in my arm, I feel. If I stick a needle in my desk, I don't feel. And that tells me what the boundaries of my body are. If a photon hits my retina, I see it. If it hits the wall behind me, I don't see it. So on this very empirical basis, we can define the boundaries of living beings. Living beings are proper subparts of nature. And in my view, that comes because of dissociation. Dissociation is what provides a boundary in terms of which we can speak of parts, of an inside and an outside. But the inanimate universe has no parts. What we call objects are just nominal projections of the structure of language. They have nothing to do with what's actually going on outside. There is only the inanimate universe as a whole, the entire inanimate universe as a whole. And now you can ask, is there something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole? Is
mm.
the inanimate universe as a whole conscious? Then I would say yes. But a rock is not conscious in and of itself. It's like neurons in my head. I am conscious, but I don't think a single neuron in my head is conscious in and of itself. No, because there is no neuron. There is only Bernardo. The neuron is a segment of Bernardo that we carve out in language for convenience. But there is only something it is like to be Bernardo, not something it is like to be every single neuron in Bernardo's head. By exactly the same token, there is only something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. And there is nothing it's like to be a moon or a rock or a cell phone in
Mm.
the inanimate universe.
I wonder whether we could look at our bodies, because if we, I see your body. I mean, if you were in, I'm seeing it on the screen now, but if you were in my study, I would be seeing your body, and that would be a dashboard representation of Bernardo. And in a sense, that isn't that body also an integral part, the thing in itself, which is probably not like a body as I see it, an integral part of that universe of everything.
The body is an appearance. The body is what
Yeah.
my dissociated mental inner life looks like when you observe it.
Yes.
So when
Yeah.
you observe this dissociated altar of the mind of nature that we call Bernardo, you see a body. So the body is what that dissociative mental process looks like. As such, the body is not a thing in itself at all. Physical reality under analytic idealism is not the thing in itself at all. All
Yeah.
physical reality, including bodies, are representations, appearances. They are a dashboard representation of measurements we make of the thing in itself. But we don't have a transparent window to see the thing in itself as it actually is. We fly a plane that has no windows, it only has the dashboard. So when the thing in itself is measured and represented on our internal dashboard, we call it Bernardo's body, or the bookshelf behind me, or the moon and the sun and the universe. These are all representations, not things in itself. As such, Bernardo's body is not a part of the thing in itself. It's a representation of a part of the thing in itself.
So really, everything we see as things, we're not seeing anything as it really is.
Of course not. Why would we?
Nothing at all. Mm,
It's useless to see things as they
yeah,
actually are. It's cognitive
yeah,
overload. It may literally make you die because there is no upper bounds to the entropy of existence. If we were to mirror the states of existence as they are, there would be no upper bounds to our internal entropy. In other words, we would be liable to melting into hot soup just by looking at the world. That's not how things work. There is nothing romantic or even spiritual about this. This is I will not say trivial because the mathematics behind it's not trivial, but this is just how things ought to be. I mean, we understand it now that that's how things ought to be. They couldn't be any different. We don't have a transparent windscreen to see the world as it is. Why would we have? It's not useful for survival. On the contrary, it's deadly, and we don't need it. A dashboard is good enough. Airplane pilots fly by instruments all the time without looking through the window. So that's how nature has put us together because of evolutionary pressures. It's just how things are.
Yeah.
It's not a great mystery or anything.
So then the mystery for me is how new dissociated alters arise. So if we say through biological reproduction, then that in itself is just an appearance in the dashboard, isn't it?
Reproduction is what the production of new dissociated alters look like when they are represented on the dashboard. Everything that is physical is a representation, but all we have to go by is the representation, so we mistake it for the reality in itself. We are like airplane pilots that were born in an airplane cockpit that has no windows. All we have ever had to navigate life is the dashboard. So we forget that the dashboard is just that, just a dashboard that shows measurements of something behind it. And we take the dashboard for the world. But yeah, reproduction as that biological process that we can observe in the womb of a woman, that's a dashboard representation of how two alters can create another one. Now, why do two alters create another one? Well, evolution tells us that because if at some point there were alters that could create new alters, those are the ones that would persist through reproduction. So those are the ones that survived. It's not that there has been a great plan or that there is a deliberate purpose behind reproduction. It's just that if that were to happen, and clearly did happen at some point in the past, then the alters that could do that are the alters that we have today, because they are the ones that would survive. The ones that couldn't reproduce didn't survive. You see?
Yeah. So it sort of raises the question of whether it could be by obviously something different, a different process from what we know now, whether it could be possible to create an AI that is conscious, because for some reason we might need one. It sounds crazy, but it's a question people are asking at the moment. You know, they see, well, I've used Chat GPT and it looks absolutely amazing and gives you lots of wonderful information. So say, oh, this must be the future.
Okay. We know that we are conscious, and we know that we are metabolizing living organisms. So to have private conscious in their life is correlated with an image, a representation that we call life, metabolism. Do we have any reason to think that something that doesn't look like life at all can also be the image of a dissociative process, of a conscious entity? I would say none whatsoever. We know that private conscious in our life looks like metabolism. Why would it also look like something entirely different? There is no rational or empirical reason to think that at all. Combustion looks like flames. Why would combustion look like snow under different circumstances? It doesn't. It looks like flames. So dissociation in the mind of nature looks like metabolism. We know that. Why should it also look like a silicon computer? There is no reason to think that whatsoever. Neither is there a need for us to create a conscious computer, because consciousness, private consciousness in our life is not needed for any practical application of AIs. Practical applications have to do, again, with structure and function. And if we can create structure and function, that's all it takes. We don't need that structure and function to be accompanied by private dissociated experiential states. Why do we need that? There is no reason for that. So I think the whole story about machine consciousness is lunacy. It's downright stupid. Look, I can run a simulation of kidney function on my computer, accurate down to the molecular level. That doesn't mean that my computer will urinate on my desk, because the simulation of a phenomenon is not the phenomenon simulated. We understand that when it comes to urine production. But we think that the simulation of the patterns of information flow in a conscious brain is also conscious. Well, that's like thinking that a computer that simulates kidney function can pee on your desk. It's stupid. There's absolutely no reason to think that. And then people say, oh, but Chat GTP looks like it is conscious. It behaves like it is conscious. And if we think that an amoeba is conscious because it behaves like a conscious being, then why don't we think that Chat GTP, which looks like it's conscious, why don't we think that it's conscious too? Well, for an incredibly trivial and obvious reason. Chat GTP was made to look like it is conscious. You know, mannequins in clothes shops, they are made to look like humans. And that's why they look like humans. We don't go around thinking about, the ethics and the rights of shop mannequins. Because you can say, well, they look like they are people, so they should be conscious. No, we don't do that, because we know the only reason they look like people is that they were created to look like people. They were created to be good imitations. And that's no reason at all to think that they inherit the properties of people, like the property of having consciousness. The same goes for Chat GTP. It was created to be a good imitation. That's why it looks like it's conscious. There is no grounds at all to think that it actually is conscious. Not any more than we have grounds to think that mannequins are conscious. I mean, the degree of cultural lunacy and delusion and downright stupidity that goes with the question of conscious machines is surreal. We are so ready to surrender reason and logic and a natural sense of healthy plausibility when it comes to these things, that science or technology willfully ignoring the boundaries it has with fiction. And even as fiction, it's bad fiction. Good science fiction is much better than machine consciousness. But anyway.
I suppose there could be a completely different form of life in some other part of the universe which doesn't metabolize, I guess,
Jenny,
but that's something we don't know anything about just now anyway.
Is that logically possible? It is. It may even be physically possible. Does this mean anything? Nothing whatsoever, because there are a great many downright stupid and silly hypotheses that are also logically possible and even physically possible. Let me give you an example. It is logically and physically possible that there is a 19th century teapot in the orbit of Saturn right now. Aliens could have come to Earth in the 19th century, stolen a teapot from your grandmother or your great-great-grandmother, and in their way back home to the Pleiades, they decided they don't like the teapot, so they dumped it, and the teapot got captured in the gravity well of Saturn. It is logically possible. But do we spend time entertaining the hypothesis seriously? No, because we have no reason to entertain the hypothesis seriously. So the same goes for non-carbon-based life. Is it logically possible? Yes. Is it even logically possible that a silicon computer could be conscious? Yes. Does it mean anything? No, it doesn't. The flying spaghetti monster is logically possible. There can logically be a flying spaghetti monster in a hyperdimension invisible to us, who, with its noodly appendages, is moving the planets around the sun. It is logically possible, but we don't spend energy taking the hypothesis seriously because we don't have any reason to entertain the hypothesis. The same goes for machine AI. It's logically possible. All right, so what? A great many things are logically possible that we don't waste our time with.
Yeah. Yes. I did an earlier podcast like this with Don Hoffman, and it seemed to me that your theory of analytic idealism and his theory of conscious realism were actually very similar in many respects. He has a concept which is very similar to your dashboard analogy, and he also uses evolutionary argument. And the main difference being, I think, is he expresses his theory in a mathematical model using Markov kernels, whereas you're taking a philosophical approach. But he describes his model as realism, and you describe yours as idealism. So can you explain what's going on there?
Idealism is a form of realism. These do not form a dichotomy.
Right.
Materialism and idealism could be said to form a dichotomy, but realism it forms a dichotomy with solipsism, not idealism. Solipsism is the notion that there is no external reality. It's all my private dream, including the other people. They only exist insofar as I dream them up. That's solipsism.
Yeah.
That forms a dichotomy with realism. Realism says there is a world out there and it's real. It's not all your only dream. Now, idealism is realist. It says that there is a world out there. Analytic idealism grants there is a real world out there. It's not your private dream. But that real world is mental. In other words, it's a form of mental realism. So analytic idealism is naturalist and it's realist. It's even reductionist. There is no dichotomy here. There is no contradiction. Don, he's trying to do science, not philosophy.
Yes,
From a philosophical perspective, our views are mutually consistent. I would not say they are the same. Don is trying to reduce physics to the dynamics of conscious agents, which I think it's a brave and worthwhile endeavor. I am not trying to do science. I'm trying to do philosophy, particularly ontology. In other words, I'm trying to account for what things are as opposed to how they behave. And Don is trying to account for how they behave by making a different philosophical postulate to guide his endeavor. Now, his philosophical postulate is entirely consistent with my philosophical argument. So there are lots of similarities, and the two are totally mutually consistent, but they're not the same in the sense that, for instance, Don's mathematics requires that there be at least two conscious agents, because reality emerges out of an interaction between conscious agents. So you need at least two of them for the mathematics to work out. Under idealism, there is no presupposition that there are two minds fundamentally. As a matter of fact, analytic idealism would say there is only one mind, one field of subjectivity. And the mathematics for that would then be field-based mathematics, not interaction-based mathematics. Field-based mathematics, for instance, is what quantum field theory does. It accounts for the complexity and the variety of existence based on the patterns of excitation of an underlying field. So there is only one field, and the many arise from that one field because one field can oscillate in many different ways. Water can ripple in many different ways. Those are also field oscillations. So that's what quantum field theory does, and analytic idealism is based on that notion that if we one day find a unified field theory in physics, then I, as a philosopher, would come and say, and that unified field is a field of subjectivity. It's, in other words, it's consciousness, and the mathematics would all still work. For Don, he still needs two agents because he needs that interaction. Now, we have had a discussion about this a few years ago, and we are both convinced that ultimately he can transpose all that to field-based math, field excitation math, and the whole thing would still work, even for one subject. but that's future work. He's doing science, I'm doing philosophy, and that's future
Yeah.
work for his science.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. What he explained to me was that set of Markov kernels actually points to one consciousness, but you can never actually get there in the mathematics. And I can see the logic
It's a set of
behind that, which is
conscious,
an interesting idea.
it's a set of conscious agents. Now,
Mm-hmm.
an agent has to be defined in terms of a boundary. If there are no boundaries, then there is only one consciousness, and you don't speak of agents, right? Agents
Yes.
need to be bound within that consciousness. Now, that boundary can be mathematically modeled as a Markov blanket.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the mathematics of Markov come in, and you
Yeah.
model the boundary as a blanket, and the states of that blanket can be used to model the interaction between what is inside the blanket and what is outside the blanket. I use the same thing in analytic idealism. I speak of dissociated alters of this field of subjectivity.
Mm.
Dissociation implies a dissociative boundary, and then I model that boundary through a Markov blanket as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I should probably explain to help people be clear about this, that as we've discussed before, you use the words mind and consciousness more or less as synonyms, whereas a lot of people listening will take our Rupert's or Francis's definition of mind as being a flow of experience, so something that starts and stops, whereas consciousness is more like the field that that you're talking about, the field of sort of ripples, mind being the activity of consciousness. So just to clarify that for people, there's a meditative state in spiritual traditions called consciousness without objects, or it's also called nirvikalpa samadhi, or pure consciousness. And it's a state in which we're aware of being aware, but there are no thoughts or perceptions present. How is that sort of modeled in your theory?
It could be modeled as a sort of a fundamental tone, a fundamental mode of excitation, um, similar to a carrier wave. If you're a communications engineer,
Right,
the way
yes.
you, for instance, when you tune into a radio station in your car, you're tuning into a particular frequency, say 108 megahertz, or 102 megahertz, or 98 megahertz. What is that? What does that frequency mean? It means the frequency of the carrier wave. The carrier wave in and of itself conveys no information. It's just a tone
Yeah.
of that frequency, just a tone, a drone, like conveys no information. So how do you hear voices and music in your car? Well, that information that you hear is modulated on top of the carrier wave. So one way to think of this, the experience of pure awareness without thoughts, without emotions, one way to conceptualize it, if it exists at all, one way to conceptualize it is to think it as a carrier wave, which is always there. In other words, consciousness, this field of subjectivity underlying all nature, it's always in an excited state. It's never completely at rest. There is always a drone in Hindu music. There is that drone, that note in the background of a song that is there all the time. There is always a drone. There is always a carrier wave. And particular thoughts, particular emotions, particular perceptions, these are all modulations of that carrier wave. They come on top of the carrier wave.
Mm-hmm.
They disrupt the carrier wave, and that's what is a thought, that's what's an emotion. But if you can stop all thoughts, all emotions, all perceptions, then you are left with the carrier wave. It's still an excitation, and therefore it's still an experience. If experience
Yes.
is an excitation of consciousness, then even when you have no thoughts, no emotions, no perceptions, there's still an experience, which is the carrier wave.
Yeah.
Now, the things we call particular experiences, like the radio programming, the specific song, the specific voice, or the specific thought, emotion, perception, that's a modulation on top of the carrier wave. That's one way to model it.
That makes a lot of sense to me anyway. And is that something that you've experienced? I wonder whether you had used any form of meditation which might take you to that place, or any other method, because in a way, in spiritual traditions, it's regarded as something natural that we don't necessarily notice, but is happening all the time. There are gaps between thoughts and perceptions. It's sometimes called natural samadhi. So I wonder whether that was something that you had experienced and come across.
Many years ago, I had a psychedelic trip, a high dose psychedelic trip that brought me to a place that when I came back, I thought, this is what the Buddhists mean when they talk about the great void. It's a place of absolute nothingness. And yet it was not nothingness, because there was something I remembered. You know, if you remember anything, then it was not absolute nothingness.
Yes,
Because otherwise
exactly.
there's nothing to remember. There's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to think about. So somehow my memory of it means that there was experience to be remembered, but the experience could be best described as a nothing. So that fits into the carrier wave idea. There is an experience, but because it's the carrier wave and not a modulation, so it's a different kind of experience than the things we normally refer to as experiences. We have this tendency to say, well, there was no experience. Actually, there was. It's just an experience that's much more basic, so much so that you don't even want to use the word experience for it. So yeah, I have had that once, not because I'm a good meditator, but because I engaged in a sort of for a year, I engaged in self-experimentation with psychedelics. And that brought me to that place.
Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes said to be the source of all creativity and original ideas, and in a very simple way, that's something I found to be true. I used to work as a business consultant, and I'd go into a company and there would be horrendous problems. And I think, what on earth am I going to suggest? And I'd captured lots of data and lots of ideas, but nothing worked. And then I just stopped. I wasn't meditating. I'd just go to the coffee machine, but there would be a gap. There would be a kind of timeless gap, and then, as often as not, some sort of solution would arise. And I wondered whether that was a similar process that you were actually using when you've developed all sorts of absolutely amazing and completely out of the box ideas. And I just wonder whether that was a process that you used, or
not consciously.
not consciously.
I recognize that answers tend to come when you are not trying to force them out.
Yes,
that I clearly recognize. But to tie that with the experience of the great void, I maybe, but I couldn't make that link. I don't feel I have enough reasons to make that link. What I can say from direct experience is that the best answers tend to arrive when you are not forcing them out. They tend to arise spontaneously. Now, whether they come because of a brief moment of the great void, I don't know. I don't know that. I don't feel that I have reasons to make a statement either way.
Yeah. I mean, This series of podcasts is called Living in Not Knowing, which refers to a quote by the non-duality teacher John Klein. It says, "Live in not knowing, free from memory." And part of the idea is that beliefs get in the way of the recognition of what we truly are, and one way out of that is descending into that great void. But the other way is, but then when you come back from that, the beliefs are all still there. So it gives you a kind of temporary experience, I guess. The other way is to really demolish the beliefs that we have by suggesting alternatives. And I felt that your work has been very much centered on helping people escape from their own limiting beliefs, in particular the belief in scientific materialism.
We have, throughout the history of the West, consistently demolished beliefs that at some point proved to be inconvenient or to depart too hard from empirical reality, so much so that it's impossible to keep on entertaining them. It, the problem is that we don't live long enough as individuals to see this process clearly unfold in the span of a lifetime. This is a historical process in culture that is very clearly discernible when you regard, a couple of thousands of cultural history in hindsight. But it's very difficult to witness that process play out during a lifetime because a lifetime is too short. But it is playing out. So we are always abandoning beliefs that prove inadequate, inconvenient, or downright false because of internal contradictions. And we are still doing that today. I do think that we have enough rational and empirical reason today to categorically abandon mainstream physicalism or materialism, the notion that reality is not mental and that mentation somehow arises from arrangements of that non-mental stuff. I think this is internally inconsistent. It's empirically inadequate. It's incoherent. In other words, there are multiple reasons to just abandon it as a fairy tale that doesn't hold up to any scrutiny whatsoever. But the abandonment of a belief that has gathered a lot of cultural momentum takes a lot of time relative to a lifetime. Relative to the whole of history, it happens very quick. It's a couple of centuries and we are somewhere else already.
Yes. Yeah.
But relative to a lifetime, we are imprisoned in a certain belief. So it's useful to abandon bad beliefs. I wouldn't go as far, and I don't think that's a Western characteristic at all. It's an Eastern characteristic that arose in another place in the world and has its usefulness and applicability given the context of that place, of that culture. But I don't think it's a Western attitude to life to say, not only are we are going to abandon the beliefs that we have good reasons to abandon, we are going to abandon all beliefs and we are going to live purely in the now, like my cat. I don't think we need to throw away the baby with the bathwater. The Western mind is characterized by some degree of historical awareness that you see very clearly when people talk about holding on to traditions. That's historical awareness. That's a sense of continuity. That's a sense that we are part of a line, an unfolding line of being, that we have ancestors, that we are not born into a vacuum, and that we are born with, a certain inheritance, and that we carry responsibility towards it. Our responsibility is to perform an alchemical operation to improve that inheritance, to transmute that inheritance into something more positive and less damaging. And these are all extremely valid things, and they themselves, if done correctly, could improve life a lot by couching our lives in the context of a meaning, as opposed to a vacuum in which we are in constant free fall. Um, and I'm not criticizing the Eastern attitude. I'm just sort of justifying or trying to highlight the differences with the Western attitude.
Yeah.
The Indians, for instance, they didn't write history. Why? Because they were not interested? No, it's because they were always aware that every king is just a manifestation of the archetypal king. Every war is just a manifestation of the archetypal conflict, that everything is a recursive play of archetypes. So specific kings, specific battles, specific historical events don't matter. What matter are the archetypes. So instead of recording history, they recorded the archetypes in their mythology. And it, for their psychology, this is the best thing to do. It's what honors them the most. But to try to transplant that one-on-one to Western psychology, I think, in a sense, it's spitting on our plate. It's spitting in the face of our ancestors. This is not our makeup. This is not our tradition. We can go about it differently, by honoring the ancestors, honoring, the evolution of thought, that we inherited, and in a sense, taking responsibility for everything that went wrong and everything that we did badly. Because if we eliminate the past completely, then who is taking responsibility for the genocide of Aboriginal cultures in the New World, in the Americas and in Australia? Who is taking responsibility for that? Who is taking responsibility for the Crusades? Who in the 22nd century is going to take responsibility for the lunacy of physicalism or materialism? If we abandon this, we abandon the memory of mistakes, and we are bound to repeat them. So I am all for, and sorry for this long answer that you didn't prompt and you didn't try to.
No, it's an excellent answer. Yeah.
I just wanted to add this to the conversation for what it's worth.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there is an educational side to it, which I feel is important. I mean, when I was at school, and I'm sure the same is true now, science was presented as being truth. And of course, the science I learned at school was way out of date. Whereas, if we study science or mathematics at a higher level, we discover it's just a set of models, but it's never taught that way in schools. And I just wonder whether we're really giving our children the right tools for a happy, harmonious life, whether we're really teaching them to reason and to understand what we can know for certain and what we can't know for certain.
Absolutely not. And it's a self-created problem. Primary school children are the least paid. Primary school teachers are paid the least, and university teachers are paid the most. So what do you get? You get the bullshit in primary school, and you get some semblance of reason much later in life when your entire psychic makeup is already etched in stone. It's a problem of our own doing. We do not recognize the responsibility that is carried by primary school teachers who are molding the intellect of people very early on, and are dealing with people, young children, who have no defenses whatsoever. And we are giving that to people who either have made a tremendous sacrifice to earn very little when they could have earned a lot more because they are clever, or to people who are doing that because they can't do anything else and there is nobody looking over their shoulders. So they mold children in completely insane and lunatic ways. And that's what's happening. If you understand what science is, the strength of science resides in its limited applicability. If you understand science, you understand that what I just said is absolutely true. The strength of science resides in its limited applicability. You
Yes.
have to know where you can apply it and what you can say about it and what you can't. If you know that, then what you do say is true. Science is true. In what sense? In the sense that if there is an asteroid passing between the Earth and the Moon, then the trajectory of that asteroid will be changed in a way that is directly proportional to the masses of the Earth and the Moon, and inversely proportional in a quadratic way to the distance between the asteroid and the Earth and the asteroid and the Moon. I just gave you Newton's law of gravity.
Yes, yes.
That will happen. It's true. What is a convenient fiction is when we say there is an invisible force that comes from the Earth and the Moon to the asteroid and pulls the asteroid. Now, that's a model. That's a convenient fiction.
Yeah.
What we know is how the trajectory of the asteroid will change. Now, why it will change? What is the agency that will cause it to change? Is it a force? Is it a curvature of space-time? Is it the flying spaghetti monster? These are all models. They are convenient fictions. And convenient fictions change over time. In the time of Newton, the convenient fiction was there is this magical, invisible force acting instantaneously at a distance between celestial bodies. He called it gravity. Now, since the early 20th century, we know there is no such force at all. It's a fairy tale. There are no such invisible forces. Bullshit. What there is an invisible curvature of the hyperdimensional fabric of space-time. That's another convenient fiction.
Yes.
And since very recently, we know it's not true at all. It's bullshit. There is no such a thing. Space and time are not primary. They are not fundamental. They arise out of lower level quantum processes. That's loop quantum gravity for you.
Yeah.
So now we are adopting a new convenient fiction. Now, none of these convenient fictions is the truth. That's why they are convenient fictions. In other words, reality behaves as though they were true in a given set of circumstances. And that's all we need. That's all science needs. Science only ever needs convenient fictions. So long as on the basis of these fictions, we can predict what nature will do next, we can develop technology. Look, a 5-year-old kid can be world champion in a computer game without having the faintest clue of what the game actually is. All the hardware, all the software that constitutes the game. How can the kid be world champion in a game that he has no idea what it is? Well, based on a convenient fiction. It goes as such. There is a little man on the screen. I am that little man. And if I shoot the other little man, I score points. Now, is any of this true? None whatsoever. There is no little man on the screen. The kid is not in the screen. Nobody's shooting or being shot. But it's a convenient fiction in the sense that the game behaves as though there were a little man in the screen shooting and being shot. And that's all the kid needs to be world champion. Technology is the same thing. All we need to develop technology is a convenient fiction. Over time, fictions that used to be convenient no longer prove to be convenient. For instance, Newtonian gravity, because of aberrations in the orbit of Mercury, ceased being convenient. Now, Mercury was moving in a way that was different from what you would expect if Newtonian gravity were actually true. So the fiction is no longer convenient given the new observations. So we adopt a new convenient fiction. And one day we will adopt another convenient fiction. the important thing to realize is that it's not like science was wrong before and it will be right in the future. That's not what's happening. Science is about predicting what nature will do. Newton predicted what nature would do. We put a man on the moon based on Newton's convenient fiction, even though we already knew it wasn't true. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. So long as it allows you to make the correct predictions, it's good enough. And that's what science is. If you understand science to be this, which is what it is, science is true. It was true yesterday, it's true today, it will be true tomorrow. The problem is when you think science to be a lot more than this, when you think that science is making statements about what nature actually is, then science is always wrong. But it's not what science is. That's not, science is not in the business of telling you what nature is. Science is in the business of telling you what nature will do next. And many scientists, especially the self-appointed spokespeople of science, who are not scientists at all, they are TV personalities. Many of them, most of them, do not understand this. And therefore, you get scientism, which is the religion that tells you that science is telling what nature is. No, science as a methodology is incapable of making definitive statements about what nature is. That's not what experiments tell you. What do experiments tell you? Well, you set up an experiment and you wait for nature to do something in response to the experimental setup. And that doing, that behavior is the result of the experiment. And that allows you to predict then what nature will do next, even if you don't do an experiment. That's what science is. It's about behavior. It's about doing. It's not about being. It's not about what is. It's not about the ontological structure of reality. It's about what you expect to see next. If you understand it, then science is correct. You can trust it.
Yes. I mean, looking beyond science, is there anything that we can know for absolute certain, looking sort of philosophically?
We can know absolutely, with absolute certainty, many of the mistakes we make and have made, because they entail, for instance, internal contradictions. They are internally inconsistent. There is a theory that within that theory, there is an internal inconsistency. The theory defeats itself. We can know that for certain. And therefore, we can safely abandon that mistake and adopt a new theory that may make new mistakes, but at least doesn't make the previous mistakes.
Yes.
So that we can know for certain. And that's all we need to advance. All we need to advance is to know at least most of the mistakes we make. And those mistakes we can know for certain because they are empirically inadequate. They can be disproven by experiment, or they are internally consistent, or they are incoherent in the sense that they are not consistent with other theories that seem to make the right predictions. So we can know our own bullshit, and therefore we can abandon it and take a step forward. That we can do, and that's all we need to make progress.
That's perfect. I think it's a perfect place to end. We can know our own bullshit. Absolutely perfect. Thank you, Bernardo. It's been great talking with you again, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks for having me, Jenny.
You're very welcome.